I never thought the most frightening experience of my life would happen on a trip that almost didn't happen. A coworker convinced me to use my vacation days before they expired. I had never traveled outside my own country before, and after comparing dozens of destinations online, I booked a cheap flight to a small mountain town in a foreign country. It wasn't famous. There weren't many reviews. Most people skipped over it because it wasn't near any major attractions. That was exactly why I chose it. I wanted somewhere quiet. The town was beautiful in a simple way. Narrow streets, old stone buildings, tiny grocery stores, and people who seemed to know each other. Very few spoke English, but everyone smiled politely. I checked into a small family-owned guest house that had only 6 rooms. The owner was an elderly woman who spoke just enough English to show me around. She handed me a metal key attached to a heavy wooden tag and pointed upstairs. Before I went to my room, she stopped me. She looked at the key, then looked back at me and slowly said, "Always lock, every time." I smiled and nodded, assuming she was talking about theft. She shook her head, "Not for stealing." Then she walked away before I could ask what she meant. At the time, I laughed it off. The room itself was cozy. Wooden floors creaked with every step, and the furniture looked older than my grandparents'. The only window overlooked a narrow street where people walked until sunset. My first day was uneventful. I wandered through local markets, tried food I couldn't pronounce, and spent the evening taking photos of the surrounding hills. Everything felt peaceful. That night, I remembered what the owner had said and locked the door before going to bed. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up because I heard footsteps in the hallway. Not unusual. Old buildings are noisy. Someone walked slowly past my room, then stopped. I waited. Nothing. A minute later, 3 gentle knocks. Not loud, just... I looked at my phone. 2:17 a.m. I stayed completely still. Maybe another guest had the wrong room. After about 30 seconds, the footsteps continued down the hallway. The next morning, I asked the owner if someone had accidentally knocked on my door during the night. She froze for just a second. Then she simply asked, "You opened?" I told her I hadn't. She smiled with obvious relief. Good. That was it. No explanation. The second day, I rented a bicycle and explored roads outside the town. Late that afternoon, I stopped at a tiny roadside cafe. An older man sitting nearby noticed the guest house key hanging from my backpack. He pointed at it. "You stay there?" I nodded. He stared at me for a few seconds before quietly saying, "Lock every night." The exact same advice. I asked why. He hesitated, searching for English words. "Sometimes." He looked toward the road. "Someone walks." I laughed awkwardly. "Someone?" He nodded. "Not guest." Then he refused to say anything else. By then, I was more curious than scared. I started wondering if the town had experienced break-ins, or maybe someone with mental health problems wandered the streets at night. That explanation made sense. The third night, I decided to stay awake. Around midnight, everything became silent. No cars, no voices, no dogs barking. It was strangely quiet. At 1:48 a.m., I heard footsteps again. Slow, steady. 1 step every few seconds. The sound stopped outside my room. I held my breath. Then came the same 3 knocks. This time I walked quietly toward the door. I didn't unlock it. I simply looked through the peephole. At first I thought no one was there. Then I noticed someone standing against the wall beside my door. Not directly in front of it, just outside the peephole's view. Whoever it was knew exactly where to stand. I couldn't see a face, only part of a shoulder. The person didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there. 5 minutes passed, then 10. My legs started hurting from standing so long. Finally, I heard slow footsteps disappear down the hallway. The next morning, I checked the hallway security camera that I had noticed near the stairs. The owner's expression changed immediately. "The camera," she sighed. "No work." I looked up. The tiny red light was off. She noticed me staring. It never worked. That seemed odd. Why leave it there if it had been broken? Later that afternoon, while buying bottled water from a small shop, I casually mentioned the nightly visitor to the cashier. The smile disappeared from his face. He looked toward the window before lowering his voice. "You hear knock?" I nodded. He leaned closer. "Don't answer." "I haven't." "Good. What if it's someone asking for help?" His expression became serious. "If help, they speak." That sentence stayed with me all evening. If help, they speak. That night, I pushed a chair against the door before locking it. I knew it probably wouldn't help much. It just made me feel better. At exactly 2:17 a.m., 3 knocks echoed through the room again. This time, something was different. Instead of walking away, the doorknob turned so slowly that, for a second, I questioned whether it was actually moving or if my eyes were playing tricks on me. The metal handle reached its limit. Then it stopped. Whoever was outside didn't knock again. They didn't try to force the door. They simply held the handle down for several seconds before letting go. Silence. I stood frozen beside the bed, barely breathing. After another minute, I heard footsteps moving away. I stayed awake until sunrise. The next morning, I told the owner exactly what had happened. She didn't seem surprised. Instead, she asked one question. "Chair?" I nodded. "You put chair?" "Yeah." She looked relieved. Then she quietly said something in her own language before disappearing into the kitchen. I was getting frustrated. Everyone knew something, but nobody would explain it. Later that day, I wandered into a small bookstore. The owner spoke better English than anyone else I'd met. After chatting for a while, I finally asked about the guest house. The smile disappeared from the owner's face. After a long pause, the owner said, "Many years ago, a traveler disappeared." I assumed they meant decades ago. Apparently no. It had happened only a few years earlier. The traveler had been staying in the same guest house. According to local rumors, another guest heard knocking during the night. The missing traveler had supposedly opened the door because they thought someone needed help. The next morning, the room was empty. The bed had never been slept in. The suitcase, passport, wallet, and phone were all still inside. The front door had remained locked from the inside until the owner unlocked it after no one answered. No signs of a struggle. No blood. Nothing stolen. The traveler was simply gone. Police searched for weeks. Nothing was ever found. The owner of the bookstore shrugged. Maybe rumor. Maybe. But everyone in town seemed to know the same story. That afternoon, I decided I was leaving early. I changed my flight to the following morning. One more night. That was all. When I returned to the guest house, the owner noticed my suitcase. She nodded approvingly. Good. No questions. No attempts to convince me to stay. That evening, I packed everything before dinner so I could leave at sunrise. I double-checked my passport, my wallet, my phone. Everything was ready. Around 11, I turned off the lights. I don't think I actually slept. I just lay there listening. At exactly 2:17 a.m. tap, the sound was identical. Same rhythm, same volume. I didn't move. A minute passed, then another. The doorknob turned again, slowly, very slowly. The chair against the door creaked slightly as the handle pushed against it. Then, a voice, soft, barely above a whisper, in perfect American English. "Excuse me." Every muscle in my body locked up. Nobody in that town had spoken English that naturally. The voice continued. "I think you dropped your phone." My phone was in my hand. I stared at the glowing screen. The voice waited. Then came another sentence. "I just need you to open the door for a second." I didn't answer. A few seconds later, it laughed, not loudly. Just one quiet chuckle, then silence. The footsteps faded away. I didn't sleep again. As soon as daylight appeared, I carried my suitcase downstairs. The owner was already awake. She looked exhausted, as if she hadn't slept either. She glanced at my face and immediately knew. "You hear voice?" It wasn't a question. I nodded. She closed her eyes for a moment. I told you, lock. Before leaving, I finally asked the question that had been bothering me since the first day. What is it? She looked toward the front door before answering. I don't know. Then she added something I'll never forget. But it learns. I left without another word. At the airport, I felt ridiculous. Once I was surrounded by hundreds of people, the whole experience seemed impossible. Lack of sleep, culture shock, an overactive imagination. I convinced myself that was all it had been. A month passed. Life returned to normal. Then, one Friday evening, I was organizing the photos from my trip. I noticed one picture I didn't remember taking. It showed the hallway outside my guest house room. The angle was strange, almost as if the phone had been held low against someone's chest. At the far end of the hallway stood a person, too far away to identify. I assumed another guest had accidentally walked into the frame. I zoomed in. The image became grainy, but one detail stood out immediately. The person wasn't facing down the hallway. They were facing my room. I checked the timestamp. 2:17 a.m., the exact time of the knocking. I looked through every other photo from the trip. Nothing unusual. Then I opened the image details. According to the metadata, the picture hadn't been taken with my rear camera. It had been taken with the front-facing camera. That made no sense. The front camera should have captured me, not the hallway. Thinking it was a software glitch, I connected my phone to my computer. The same file appeared. Same timestamp, same image, same hallway. I enlarged it one last time. Near the edge of the frame, barely visible, was the side of a shoulder. The angle suddenly made sense. The phone wasn't inside my room. It was outside my door. Whoever had taken the picture had been standing in the hallway, holding my phone while facing my room. I checked my travel photos again. There wasn't a single moment during that vacation when my phone had gone missing, not even for a minute. I still have that picture. I've shown it to photographers, friends, and even someone who works in digital imaging. No one has been able to explain how a front-facing camera produced an image from outside my hotel room. Sometimes I think about sending the original file to someone online to see if they can figure it out. Then I remember the owner saying one final thing as I walked out the door. It learns. And I can't stop wondering whether opening that photo over and over is exactly what it wants. I never expected a routine border crossing to become the one memory I still can't explain. I've traveled outside the United States several times for work, and after a while, border checkpoints all start to feel the same. Long lines, tired travelers, officers checking passports with expressions that never change. You answer a few questions, collect your bag, and move on. This trip was supposed to be no different. I had spent a week exploring a rural part of a foreign country after finishing a business conference. Instead of flying back from the same airport I arrived at, I decided to cross into a neighboring country by bus because it was cheaper and gave me another day to sightsee before my flight home. The ride lasted most of the afternoon. The scenery slowly changed from busy towns to empty farmland, then to thick forests that seemed to stretch forever. Cell service became unreliable about an hour before we reached the checkpoint. By sunset, our bus pulled into a fenced inspection area surrounded by floodlights. Everyone was instructed to take their luggage and wait outside while officials inspected the vehicle. Nothing unusual. There were maybe 20 passengers altogether, families, a couple of backpackers, an elderly couple, a businessman talking quietly on his phone. I noticed one traveler standing several feet away from everyone else. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about them. They wore plain clothing, no luggage, no backpack, no jacket despite the cold. What stood out wasn't their appearance, it was that nobody seemed to acknowledge them. The officers walked around them as if they weren't there. Passengers accidentally stepped into their space without apologizing. It was almost like everyone unconsciously ignored them. I figured they had arrived separately. Maybe they weren't even with our bus. Eventually, we were called inside a concrete inspection building. The process moved slowly. One by one, each passenger approached a counter where an officer examined passports before waving them through another door. I stood near the back of the line. The traveler without luggage remained behind me. After 20 minutes, only 3 people remained. Me, the traveler, and the businessman. The businessman finished first, then it was my turn. The officer looked through my passport, asked where I had been, asked why I was traveling, stamped the page, routine questions. As I picked up my passport, I casually nodded toward the traveler behind me. They've been waiting too. The officer looked confused. Who? I turned. The traveler was still standing exactly where they'd been. Right there. The officer leaned slightly to see around me. I don't understand. I pointed. The person behind me. The officer stared for another few seconds before saying something to another guard in his own language. Both of them looked directly toward the line. Neither reacted. One finally asked, "Are you traveling alone?" I laughed. "Yeah." He nodded. "Then continue." His expression made it clear the conversation was over. I walked through the next security door feeling embarrassed. Maybe I'd mistaken a reflection in the glass. Maybe the traveler had walked away. Still, when I reached the baggage scanner, I glanced back. The traveler was still standing in line, waiting, without moving. Outside, passengers were reloading luggage beneath the bus. I climbed aboard and found my seat near the middle. 5 minutes later, the last passengers returned. The doors closed. The driver counted everyone, then frowned. He counted again. One of the officers climbed aboard. They quietly compared a passenger list. After another minute, everyone was asked to remain seated. Apparently, the head count didn't match. Someone was missing, or someone extra was on board. The officers checked every passport again. Each name matched the passenger manifest. 20 passengers, exactly as expected. The driver apologized for the delay. The bus pulled away. I settled back into my seat, relieved the confusion was over. About 15 minutes later, I noticed something strange. The empty seat directly across the aisle wasn't empty anymore. The traveler without luggage sat there. I had been looking out the window almost the entire ride. Nobody had walked past me. Nobody had boarded after we left. Yet there they were, quietly staring forward, hands folded, perfectly still. I looked toward the front of the bus. None of the other passengers seemed to notice. I convinced myself they must have been seated there all along. Travel has a way of making you question your memory. Another hour passed. Darkness covered everything outside. The only light came from the bus interior. Most passengers were asleep. I woke suddenly after dozing for maybe 20 minutes. The bus had stopped, not at another checkpoint, just stopped. The engine was still running. The driver was speaking with someone outside. I looked through the windshield. 2 border officers stood in the road waving flashlights. That didn't make sense. We had already crossed. Everyone else seemed just as confused. The driver opened the door. One officer climbed aboard carrying a flashlight. He walked slowly down the aisle, looking carefully at every passenger. When he reached my row, he stopped. He shined the flashlight directly across the aisle, at the traveler, then lowered the light. His face lost all color. Without saying a word, he turned around and hurried off the bus. Seconds later, both officers began arguing outside. One kept pointing toward our bus. The other repeatedly shook his head. Finally, the driver shut the door and pulled away without another explanation. Nobody spoke for several minutes. Then the woman sitting behind me leaned forward. She whispered just loudly enough for me to hear. "Did you see who he looked at?" I nodded. She swallowed hard. I thought I was the only one. For the rest of the drive, neither of us spoke. I wanted to ask her exactly what she had seen, but something about the way she was gripping the armrest told me she was just as afraid of saying it out loud as I was. The bus eventually reached a small transportation terminal shortly after midnight. It wasn't our final destination, just a scheduled stop where passengers could use the restroom or buy food before continuing. As everyone stepped off the bus, I deliberately slowed down. The traveler remained seated, still perfectly motionless. I watched from outside through the window. They never looked up, never blinked, never shifted in their seat. When the driver walked back onto the bus to check for forgotten luggage, he walked right past them without even turning his head. I couldn't understand it. The driver should have asked why they weren't getting off. Instead, he acted as though that seat was empty. The woman who had spoken to me earlier walked over while I was staring through the window. She quietly asked, "You can still see them?" I nodded. "So can I." That sentence made my stomach tighten. At least I wasn't imagining it. She explained that she'd first noticed the traveler while everyone was waiting outside during the first inspection. She assumed it was another passenger until the officers repeatedly looked straight through them. "I almost asked my husband if he saw them," she whispered. Then I realized he never looked at that side of the line. I glanced around. Her husband was standing only a few feet away, drinking coffee. He looked completely relaxed. She lowered her voice even further. "Don't point." "Why?" "Because every time someone points," she stopped herself. "What?" "I don't know. I just don't think we should." Before I could ask anything else, the driver called everyone back onto the bus. I intentionally boarded last. The traveler was still sitting across from my seat. As I walked past, I noticed something that immediately felt wrong. There was no luggage in the overhead compartment, no jacket hanging beside the window, no water bottle, no signs that anyone had occupied the seat except for the traveler themselves. Almost as if they had appeared there with absolutely nothing. The journey continued. Around an hour later, everyone was asleep again. Everyone except me and the traveler. I finally gathered enough courage to look directly at them. For the first time since I'd noticed them, they slowly turned their head. Not toward the window, toward me. Their expression was completely blank. No anger, no smile, no emotion at all. Then they mouthed 3 silent words. "Wrong bus." No sound came out, just the movement of their lips. A second later, they faced forward again. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought someone else would hear it. I didn't sleep again that night. Just before sunrise, the bus reached another checkpoint. This one was much smaller. Only 2 officers were working. Everyone handed over their passports while remaining seated. One officer boarded and began checking each passenger one by one. When he reached my row, he looked at my passport, returned it, then paused. His eyes drifted to the empty seat across from me. His expression changed instantly. He looked at me, then back at the seat, then quietly asked, "Has anyone been sitting there?" I froze. Finally, someone else noticed. I answered carefully. "Yes," he frowned. "Since when?" "Since the first border crossing." He immediately stepped off the bus without another word. Within minutes, every passenger was instructed to get off again. This inspection was nothing like the first. Officers searched every bag. They photographed the interior of the bus. One officer measured footprints in the dirt beneath the entrance. I overheard another asking the driver if he had stopped anywhere unexpectedly. The driver insisted he hadn't. After almost an hour, we were allowed back on board. As I climbed the steps, I looked toward my row. The seat was empty, actually empty. The traveler was gone. For the first time in hours, I felt myself relax. I assumed whoever or whatever I had seen was over. A few minutes after we pulled away, the woman from behind me leaned forward again. She looked confused. "Where did they go?" "I don't know." "You don't either." I shook my head. Neither of us spoke again for the remainder of the trip. When we finally reached the airport later that morning, I was eager to forget everything. I boarded my flight home. After nearly 15 hours of traveling, I unlocked my front door and collapsed into bed. For several days, I convinced myself exhaustion had caused everything. Then, about a week later, curiosity got the better of me. I searched online for news about that first border crossing. Eventually, I found an article from several years earlier. It described an overnight bus that had arrived at the checkpoint after a fatal highway accident. According to the report, every passenger had been accounted for except one. Authorities believed the missing traveler had wandered away into the surrounding forest while suffering from shock. Despite an extensive search, they were never found. One detail caught my attention. Witnesses couldn't agree on where the traveler had been sitting. Every survivor gave a different seat number. Some insisted the traveler had been near the front. Others remembered them near the back. Several couldn't remember seeing them at all. The article included a blurry photograph taken during the investigation. It showed officers standing beside the damaged bus. Every passenger was gathered nearby. I counted them twice, then a third time. There was one more person in the photograph than listed in the official report, standing several feet away from everyone else. Hands folded, no luggage, looking directly toward the camera. The image quality wasn't good enough to identify a face, but I recognized the posture immediately. I enlarged the picture until it became nothing but pixels. One final detail appeared near the bottom of the article. A retired border officer had been interviewed years after the incident. He made a statement that investigators dismissed as stress-related. He claimed that on rare occasions, a traveler would appear at the checkpoint carrying no belongings and no documents. The strange part wasn't that they couldn't be identified. It was that only one or two people in line ever seemed able to notice them. His supervisors told him never to include those reports in official paperwork because they couldn't be verified. The interviewer asked him what happened if someone acknowledged the traveler. His answer was only one sentence. If they leave with you once, they'll try to leave with you again. I closed my laptop immediately. I hadn't thought about that trip in months. That night, while unpacking an old suitcase from the trip, I found something wedged inside one of the side pockets. It wasn't mine. It was a worn boarding pass, completely blank, no airline, no destination, no passenger name, just one line printed across the center. Seat 14B. I stared at it for several minutes before realizing something that made my blood run cold. On that bus, my seat had been 14A. The impossible traveler had been sitting directly across the aisle, in seat 14B. I burned the boarding pass in my backyard that same night. The paper blackened instantly, but one corner refused to burn. When I picked it up with a stick, the words had changed. There was no seat number anymore, only 3 words. Next crossing soon. I haven't traveled internationally since. Maybe it's just trauma making me paranoid. Maybe there was a perfectly rational explanation for everything. But whenever I watch videos of crowded border checkpoints online, I always pause them for a second, just to make sure there isn't someone standing slightly apart from everyone else, waiting for someone to notice them.